The desert had its own kind of silence, the kind that seemed alive, humming beneath the stars as if the land itself carried old secrets. Out where the mesquite shadows stretched long, and the coyotes called to one another across the canyon, a man could hear his own heartbeat clearer than the rush of blood in his ears. It was the kind of silence that reminded him he was only a guest here, and that the land belonged to someone older, someone who had been watching long before he ever rode across it. He sat by his small fire, the glow rising and fading with each gust of wind, and in that fragile circle of light stood a figure who did not belong to the shadows, but neither did she belong to his world. She was Apache young, but with the steadiness of someone who had learned survival early. She carried herself with a dignity that firelight could not dim. Her dark eyes did not waver as she looked at him, not in fear nor in hesitation, but in something harder to name. The man felt as though she could see straight through his worn coat and tired skin, down to the part of him he did not show others. She spoke softly, her voice carrying like the desert wind, yet every word was heavy enough to unsettle him. "If I please you tonight, will you keep me forever?" The fire cracked, sending sparks up into the night, and for a moment he wondered if he had imagined her words. The desert had a way of bending the mind, making men hear things they longed for or feared. But she was still there, her face half-shadowed, her hands calm at her sides. The question she asked was not one of play or flirtation. It was raw, threaded with something deeper, as if she carried the weight of an entire life in that single promise. He remembered the stories he had heard about the Apache, their pride, their strength, their battles against soldiers who came with rifles and flags. He knew their daughters were not given lightly, nor were their words spoken without meaning. To hear such a vow was to stand at the edge of something dangerous, something binding. And yet, for reasons he could not explain, he did not rise to walk away. The air around them shifted. The wind carried a dry rustle through the sagebrush, and somewhere in the distance, an owl gave a low, haunting call. The man's horse, tied loosely to a post, stamped nervously as if it too sensed the strangeness of the moment. He thought of the long trail behind him, the towns with their dust and noise, the faces of strangers who passed by without care, the saloons filled with smoke where promises meant nothing. Here, in the wild silence of Apache country, a single question carried more weight than all the empty vows of men. Her eyes did not blink, waiting for him to answer, but his tongue felt dry. What did she mean by forever? Did she mean the kind of keeping that was born of chains? Or did she mean something else, something like belonging, something like a vow that neither distance nor time could break? He wanted to ask, but the words caught in his throat. The Apache girl did not move closer, nor did she draw away. She seemed carved from the very stone of the canyon, steady and timeless. Her braids lay against her shoulders, dark against the fire's glow, and her presence was more commanding than any rifle he had ever faced. He wondered how she had come to stand here at his fire. Was she sent, or had she come of her own will? Was she testing him, or offering him something he could not yet grasp? The firelight made shadows dance along the ground, stretching their shapes until they looked like spirits circling the camp. The man thought of all the choices that had led him here, choices made in haste, in anger, or in hunger.
Apps.
This was not chance at all. Perhaps the land itself had pulled him to this moment, to this girl, to this question that echoed louder than the coyote's cry. His chest tightened as he realized the weight of silence between them. She had spoken her part, and now he was the one left standing in the dark of his own hesitation. He remembered how the old trail hands used to say that a man could walk 100 miles and never see the end of his own loneliness. Maybe she saw that in him. Maybe that was why she had spoken those words. Still, he could not shake the thought that this was more than a simple request. It was a test of his soul, a choice that would bind him to more than her. It would bind him to her people, to her struggles, to the land that she came from. He thought of the soldiers he had passed on the road, their boots polished, their rifles ready. He thought of the way they spoke of the Apache, not as people, but as obstacles. To keep her forever would mean defying the very world he had known, standing against men in uniform who would not forgive him for choosing differently. The owl called again, its cry sharp and lonely. The firewood cracked, collapsing inward, and the sparks spiraled up into the dark. Her eyes flickered with that light, but her expression did not change. She was waiting, and in her waiting, she gave him no escape. He found himself leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his breath heavier than before. The desert was wide, endless, and yet at this moment it felt small, as though all of its weight pressed into this single fire, this single question. He wondered if she feared the answer as much as he did, or if she already knew the path she wanted to take. The man tried to find words, but the desert seemed to hold his voice still. He wanted to ask her what forever meant in her tongue, in her way. He wanted to ask if she knew the danger of binding her life to a drifter whose past carried more shadows than light. But the words did not come. Instead, he met her gaze, and in that silent exchange he felt the depth of her question sink into him. Her whisper lingered in his ears like the echo of a prayer, fragile yet unbreakable. He could not unhear it. The promise she offered was both gift and burden, and he knew that whatever answer he gave would shape the rest of his days. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Both of them turned their heads toward the sound. The firelight did not reach far, but the desert was alive with movement, unseen yet close. The man reached instinctively for the rifle at his side, though his eyes never left her face. For a heartbeat, everything was still, as if the land itself held its breath. The Apache girl did not flinch. Her voice, soft yet steady, broke the silence again, carrying across the flames with a weight that made his pulse quicken. "Will you choose me, or will you walk away?" And before he could draw breath to answer, the darkness beyond the fire shifted, and the night revealed that they were not alone. The man's hand stayed firm on the rifle, though his grip tightened with every second of silence. The desert had a way of carrying sounds farther than they truly were, and yet this noise was close, too close to ignore. The Apache girl did not stir, her eyes fixed on the darkness as if she already knew what lurked beyond it. Her calmness unsettled him more than the sound itself, because she gave no sign of fear, only patience, as though she had been waiting for this moment. From the shadows came a flicker of movement, low and deliberate. The horse pulled at its reins, uneasy, and the fire snapped again, sending a harsh light that revealed nothing beyond the brush. He felt the weight of unseen eyes, watching, measuring. His own thoughts turned quick, wondering if she had brought him into a trap. Was she alone, or had others been following all along? The land belonged to her people, and he was the stranger here, exposed under their sky. But she turned to him, her voice low. "Do not raise your rifle. They will see it as a threat." Her words carried both warning and reassurance. And the man hesitated, lowering the barrel, but keeping it close. He searched her face, trying to read her meaning. Was she protecting him, or protecting them? The firelight made her expression unreadable, yet her tone left no room for doubt. She was not afraid. The brush parted slowly, and two figures stepped into the circle of dim light. Both wore the marks of the desert leather worn from use, hair braided back, eyes sharp and watchful. They moved like shadows themselves, quiet but deliberate, each step steady. One carried a bow, the other nothing more than a knife at his side, but their presence alone was enough to stir unease. They did not look at the man first. Their eyes went to the girl, and something passed between them, silent but heavy. The man realized then that this was no accident. She had not wandered into his firelight by chance. She had come with a purpose, and these two were part of it. Still, her earlier words hung in the air, clinging to him with a weight he could not shake. "If I please you tonight, will you keep me forever?" He had not answered, and now others had arrived to hear what he might say. The taller of the two men spoke, his voice low but firm. "You sit on Apache land, stranger? You build fire where the spirits walk." His tone was not one of open threat, but neither was it welcoming. It carried the authority of someone who did not expect to be challenged. The man met his gaze, steady though uncertain, and spoke carefully. "I ride where the trail takes me," meant no harm. The second figure, younger but no less stern, stepped forward. His eyes narrowed on the rifle at the man's side, then flicked toward the girl. "Why do you sit with him?" he asked her, not unkindly, but with confusion. It was as if her presence by the stranger's fire broke some order they had expected. The girl's voice did not falter, "'Cause I chose to." The words hung sharper than any blade, and even the desert seemed to grow still at her defiance. The two men exchanged a look, but they did not argue. Instead, they sat near the edge of the fire's glow, keeping a distance, yet making their presence clear. The air between them all was thick, with something unspoken. The man tried to steady his breath, though unease gnawed at him. He had wandered through towns where lawmen watched him with suspicion, through saloons where drunkards looked for trouble, but this was different. These eyes held no drunken haze, no careless swagger. They were sharp, measured, and they carried a history he did not share. The girl leaned closer, her voice low enough only for him to hear. "Do not fear them. They are my kin. They watch because they must." Her words settled in him like a stone, heavy but grounding. He studied her again, searching for answers in the calm that never left her face. Why him? Why tonight? What did she want from a man who had nothing to give but the trail beneath his boots? As the fire burned lower, the desert grew colder. The two men remained quiet, but their presence alone spoke of protection, of guardianship. Now the girl stayed beside him, though her nearness both steadying and troubling. He remembered her question once more, the way her whisper had carried like a vow. Forever was a dangerous word, and yet it stirred something in him that no town nor trail had ever touched. His mind drifted to his own past, though he rarely let himself linger there. He had left behind faces he could no longer recall clearly, voices that blurred with time. The trail had taken more from him than it had ever given. And now, here in the wild silence of Apache land, a girl with eyes like dark stone asked him for an answer he was not sure he could give. The night stretched long, filled with the small sounds of desert life. The owl called again, the coyotes answered in the distance, and the fire sank into glowing embers.
Wow.
No one spoke for some time, but the weight of unspoken words grew heavier. The man felt caught between two worlds, one that had never accepted him, and one that did not yet trust him. When dawn finally edged across the horizon, painting the sky in pale colors, the two men stood without a word. They gave the girl a long, measured look before melting back into the desert brush, their steps vanishing like mist. The man watched them go, unsettled by their silence, yet more unsettled by the calm that remained in her. She had not moved all night, as if her patience knew no limits. As the sun touched the desert, she finally spoke again.
"You wonder why I came to you?"
Her voice was steady, though softer now, touched by the morning light. He did not answer, but his silence was its own admission. She nodded, as though she had expected that. "There are paths chosen for us before we take them," she said. "I saw yours, and I stepped into it." Her words were simple, yet they carried the kind of weight he could not dismiss. He wanted to press her, to ask what she meant, but he found himself quiet, caught in the strange certainty of her tone. She looked toward the rising sun, her face lit with its glow, and continued. "My people watch. They do not trust easily. You're a stranger, and strangers bring danger. But I asked you because I wish to know what lies in you. Q. If you keep me, you keep more than me." Her eyes turned back to his, holding him steady. "You keep the burden of my people, the burden of the land." The words struck deep. He felt the truth in them, even if he did not yet understand their full meaning. The weight of her question grew heavier still, pressing against the quiet part of his soul he tried so often to bury. He opened his mouth to speak, to find some way of answering, but before he could, a sound carried across the desert plains, distant, yet sharp enough to cut through the morning stillness. It was not the cry of an owl, nor the call of a coyote. It was harsher, metallic, and it carried the echo of men. The girl's head turned quickly, her expression tightening for the first time. Her calm shifted into alertness, and her hand pressed lightly against his arm. "Riders," she said. The word alone was enough to quicken his heart. The man strained his ears, and then he heard it too, the clatter of hooves against hard earth, the distant jingle of spurs, the murmur of voices carried by the wind. Soldiers, perhaps, or hunters, wherever they were coming fast. The girl's eyes fixed on him, no longer soft but fierce, demanding. "Now you must decide," she whispered, her words sharper than the rising sun. "Will you stand with me, or will you let them take what they came for?" Before he could answer, the sound of hooves grew louder, filling the desert with a storm that promised no easy escape. The sound of hooves carried across the desert like a storm gathering strength. At first it was a distant thunder, faint enough to mistake for wind rushing through the canyons. But soon it grew heavier, deliberate, pounding against the hard ground with purpose. The man's pulse quickened, though he kept still, his hand resting near his rifle. He had heard that sound many times before, in towns and on trails, but out here in Apache country, it carried a sharper edge, a warning that trouble was drawing near. The girl's gaze remained fixed on the horizon where the dust began to rise. The early light revealed faint outlines of riders cresting the ridge, their shapes blurred but unmistakable. Soldiers, he thought. The straight lines of their movement, the way their numbers held together like a unit, told him this was no band of drifters. His chest tightened. Soldiers riding into Apache land meant only one thing: conflict. She did not flinch. Her calm unsettled him more than the riders themselves. Her hand pressed against his arm again, steady but firm, and her voice was low. They come for more than the land. They come for me. Her words cut into him, heavy with meaning, though she gave no further explanation. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to demand what she meant, but there was no time. The riders were closing the distance, their voices now clear enough to catch on the dry wind. Orders barked, boots striking stirrups, the metallic rattle of rifles shifting in leather straps. His horse stamped nervously, pulling at its reins, sensing the storm before it broke. The girl moved closer, her braids brushing her shoulders as she leaned in. If you stand with me, you stand against them. If you walk away, you will never see me again. The choice hung in the air, heavier than any he had faced. He thought of the two Apache men who had watched by the fire the night before. They had melted into the desert at dawn, but he could not shake the thought that they lingered still, unseen, guarding from the shadows. If soldiers had tracked her this far, then perhaps her kin already knew of the danger. The girl's calmness, her patience, all of it suggested she had been waiting for this. And now he was caught in the middle, with no trail to ride away on that would not carry guilt behind him. The riders drew close enough that he could see the dust coating their boots, the sun catching the brass of their buttons. Their faces were hard, young and old, men who had marched under orders that left no room for questions. One of them shouted, his voice sharp and commanding, "You there? Step away from the girl." The order cracked across the desert like a whip. The man's jaw tightened. His grip on the rifle shifted, though he kept it low, barrel resting against his knee. He had no wish to fire, but the soldier's tone made it clear they would not treat this as a meeting of equals. The girl stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes burning steady. She did not hide behind him, nor did she retreat. Instead, she faced them head-on, her voice carrying across the space between. "This is my land. You ride where you are not welcome." Her words were fierce, yet measured, the kind that carried not just defiance, but truth. The soldiers slowed their approach, circling their horses restless under the growing heat of the rising sun. The man felt their eyes settle on him, measuring, deciding whether he was a drifter caught in their path or a traitor standing against them. His silence became its own kind of answer, though he had spoken nothing. The leader, a broad-shouldered officer with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward in the saddle. His gaze hardened as it fixed on the girl. "You belong with us now. You were promised." His words sent a chill through the man, though he did not yet understand their meaning. Promised? To whom? The girl's face remained steady, but her voice carried steel. "I belong to no one." She took a step closer to the man's fire, as though planting her place beside him, unshaken by the numbers before her. The officer's expression darkened. He motioned for his men to fan out, forming a loose half-circle. Their rifles stayed slung, but their presence alone was enough to choke the air. The man could see where this was heading, and his chest grew heavy. If bullets flew, the desert would drink deep before the sun climbed higher. As the tension thickened, the man's thoughts drifted for a moment, pulled by the threads of what he had heard. Promised. The word gnawed at him. Had she been taken before, forced into the hands of soldiers, or was there some agreement made by others? Bargains struck without her voice. Whatever it was, her defiance now made clear she would not accept it. And he was standing where her choice and their orders collided. The girl's kin returned to his mind, the two watchers by the fire. He wondered if they were hidden now among the rocks, bows drawn, eyes locked on the soldiers. If so, one wrong move would light the desert into violence none of them could contain. The officer spoke again, his voice cutting sharp. "Stranger, step aside. She is not yours to keep." The man's throat tightened. The words mirrored her whisper from the night before, the vow she had asked him to make. If I please you tonight, will you keep me forever?" He had not answered then, but now the world demanded an answer in front of rifles and fire. His silence stretched, and every rider's eye fixed on him. His fingers brushed the worn wood of the rifle, his heart pounding with the weight of a decision that could not be undone. The girl turned her head slightly, her gaze locking with his. In her eyes there was no fear, only expectation, as though she had known all along this moment would come. Her voice, low but clear, reached only him. "Do not let them decide for us." The desert seemed to hold its breath. The sun rose higher, the light glinting on steel, the horses stamping restless. The man felt the eyes of soldiers on his back, the unseen eyes of Apache in the rocks, and the steady fire of hers fixed on his soul. He had walked many trails, but none as narrow as this. Then came another sound, faint but distinct, cutting through the weight of silence. It was the sharp whistle of a hawk overhead, circling high above the riders. The soldiers glanced upward, uneasy, though the officer kept his gaze forward. The man saw the girl's lips pressed together, not in fear but in recognition. The hawk's cry was no accident. It was a signal. The officer barked, his patience snapping. "Last chance. Step aside, or face what comes." His men shifted in their saddles, hands brushing the butts of rifles, eyes narrowing. The desert air grew so tight it seemed one heartbeat might break it. The man's decision hovered, unspoken, his silence louder than words. His eyes moved from the officer to the girl, then back to the dust rising behind the soldiers where he thought he saw the faintest flicker of movement among the rocks. The hawk cried again, sharper this time, and the girl's voice whispered one final time at his side. "Whatever you choose, choose it now." And before the man could draw breath to speak, a shadow shifted on the ridge, and the first arrow streaked down from the rocks, slicing the air between fire and rifle, shattering the fragile stillness of dawn. The arrow cut the morning air with a sharp hiss before burying itself in the ground just short of the officer's horse. The animal reared, hooves striking, nearly throwing its rider. Shouts broke across the line of soldiers as they fumbled for rifles, their calm shattered in an instant. Dust rose in wild clouds as the horses stamped and twisted, caught between discipline and panic. The man froze, his heart pounding like a drum. He knew in that instant what he had suspected all along. The Apache were hidden in the ridges, watching, waiting, and now they had chosen to reveal themselves. The hawk's cry had not been the sound of nature, but a signal for war. The officer steadied his horse, his face red with fury, his scar twisting as he bared his teeth. "Ambush," he roared, his hand cutting through the air as he gave the order. Rifles swung up, barrels glinting under the sun. The man gripped his own rifle, caught between two fires. If he fired at the soldiers, he would brand himself a traitor in their eyes, hunted until his last breath. If he turned on the Apache, he would betray the girl who stood beside him, her whisper of forever still burning in his chest. The weight of that choice pressed harder than any trigger. From the ridge, more arrows whistled down, sharp and swift, driving the soldiers into chaos. Horses screamed, some throwing riders, others bolting into the desert. A rifle cracked, the shot echoing across the canyon, and dust leaped from the rocks where the Apache lay hidden. The battle was no longer waiting, it had begun. The girl did not move from his side. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with fire as she watched the soldiers scatter. She reached for his arm, her voice low, urgent. "Do not fear. Stand with me." Her words carried the weight of a vow, but the man's chest tightened. He was no stranger to violence, but this was not his fight at least. It had not been until now. Yet the line between choice and fate blurred with every cry of battle. The desert did not allow room for bystanders. The officer's voice cut through the din. "Seize her. Take her alive." His men rallied at the order, some swinging down from their saddles, others dismounting to steady their rifles. The man felt their eyes dart toward him, measuring whether he would resist. The girl's grip tightened, her presence like a flame against the cold. Suddenly, a figure burst from the rocks above, leaping down with the speed of a hawk striking its prey. It was one of the Apache men he had seen by the fire the night before, bow still in hand, knife at his belt. His cry split the morning as he landed among the soldiers, forcing them back with a flurry of arrows loosed at close range. Another figure appeared behind him, the younger man, his blade flashing in the light. The man realized then that the girl had never been alone. She had drawn him into a circle far larger than he understood. This was no chance meeting, no quiet question by a fire. It was a moment spun from a web of choices, and now it held him fast. Gunfire roared, rattling through the canyon. The acrid sting of smoke filled the air as soldiers fired toward the ridges, sparks flying from stone where bullets struck. Arrows answered, swift and silent, cutting through the din with deadly precision. The man crouched low, torn between cover and action, his hand tight on the rifle he had yet to fire. The girl pulled him toward the shadow of a boulder, her voice cutting through the chaos. "They will take me if you do nothing. If they take me, there is no return." Her words struck hard, laced with a truth that left no room for doubt. She was not pleading. She was telling him the cost of his silence. The officer shouted again, driving his men forward. "Push them back! Bring her down!" The soldiers advanced, rifles flashing, their boots pounding against the earth. The Apache fought with the land itself, vanishing into brush and stone, striking quick before melting away. But their numbers were fewer. The soldiers pressed harder, their discipline steadying their fear. The man felt the world closing around him. His pulse hammered in his ears, louder than the gunfire, louder than the cries. The girl's eyes burned into him, demanding his choice without words. Could walk away now, slip into the desert's endless horizon, and leave this fight behind. But if he did, her whisper would haunt him forever, her question unanswered, her vow broken before it was made. He lifted his rifle, the wood warm under his grip, and sighted the officer who barked orders from horseback. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single figure, the man who demanded chains for her, who saw her as something promised, something taken. His finger brushed the trigger, and time slowed. But before he could fire, the officer's eyes locked with his, sharp and knowing. The scarred face twisted into a grim smile, as though he had expected this very moment. "Stranger." The officer roared across the din, "Choose wisely. Stand against us, and you'll hang before the next moon." His words cracked like a whip, meant to cut through doubt, to remind the man of the price of rebellion. The girl's hand pressed against his back, steadying him, grounding him. "Do not let their fear bind you," she whispered, fierce against the storm. Arrows rained again from the ridge, striking soldiers, driving them back a step, but their rifles answered with brutal force. One of the Apache men staggered, his shoulder torn by a shot, his cry swallowed by the chaos. The younger man pulled him back into cover, their defiance burning even as blood darkened the earth. The desert became a battlefield of smoke and dust, cries of men and horses mixing with the whistling of arrows and the crack of rifles. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that danced with fire and death. Every breath the man drew tasted of gunpowder and sand. The officer raised his pistol high, his voice carrying above the storm. "Seize them both." His horse lunged forward, hooves pounding as his men surged with him. The man felt the ground shake beneath the charge, the earth trembling with the weight of choices he could no longer avoid. The girl turned to him, her face fierce yet steady, her voice cutting through the roar. "Now is the moment. Choose your path." Her words struck harder than any bullet, for they carried not just a choice of sides, but the choice of who he would become. The riders closed in, rifles flashing, dust choking the air. The Apache fought with fury, but their numbers thinned, their cries sharper, their strength stretched. The man's rifle stayed raised, his breath locked in his chest. Every sound seemed distant now, muffled by the pounding of his heart. The desert had brought him many trials, but none like this. He had walked as a drifter, nameless and rootless, but now the land demanded more. "Forever," she had whispered. Forever, he thought, as the officer's pistol glared in the sun and the soldiers bore down like a tide. The man knew he had only a heartbeat left before the world shattered around him. And in that heartbeat, his choice, whatever it was, would burn across the desert forever. The world seemed to stop moving in that heartbeat when the soldiers charged and the Apache arrows sang through the air. Dust rose in thick clouds, swallowing the sun, and all the man could hear was the pounding of his own heart. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the crack of his rifle split through the chaos. The officer's pistol dropped from his hand, his horse screaming as it reared. For an instant, the charge faltered. The soldiers' shouts turned to confusion, their discipline shaken as their leader slumped sideways in the saddle. The man lowered the rifle, his chest heaving. There was no going back now. In the eyes of the soldiers he had chosen, and in the eyes of the Apache, he had spoken without words. The girl beside him did not move, but her eyes locked onto his with a fire that burned brighter than the flames of battle. She gave a single nod, as though to say she had expected this all along. The fight raged on. The soldiers pressed hard, their rifles cutting into the ridges, their boots grinding over stone and sand. The Apache struck with precision, fading into brush and shadow, striking where the enemy least expected. The man fought alongside them, the rifle steady in his hands, each shot carrying the weight of survival. He was no longer a drifter, standing apart from the world. He was bound to this fight, bound to the girl whose whisper had brought him here, bound to the land that demanded loyalty not in words but in blood. The sun climbed higher as the battle wore on. Horses scattered, some riderless, some carrying men who clung to their saddles with wounds too deep to hide. Smoke from the rifles hung in the air, mixing with the desert dust, choking every breath. The man lost count of how many shots he fired, how many times he pressed himself against stone while bullets split the air. He saw the two Apache men he had met before, one wounded but still standing, the other fighting with the fury of a hawk. They moved as if the desert itself gave them strength. At last, when the heat pressed like fire against the skin, and the cries of battle rang thin, the soldiers broke. Without their officer to drive them forward, their line crumbled. Some fled back toward the ridge, their rifles clattering against their saddles as they mounted in haste. Others dropped their weapons, stumbling into the desert with no order to guide them. The man watched as they vanished into the horizon, leaving the ground littered with the wreckage of their fight. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged breaths of those who remained. The girl stood tall, her gaze sweeping across the field with a quiet strength. Her kin emerged from the ridges, their faces hard but their eyes carrying both grief and triumph. The wounded were tended to with hands that knew loss well, their pain absorbed by the land as if it had seen this too many times before. The man lowered his rifle, his arms heavy, his chest aching with more than fatigue. He looked to the girl, seeking in her eyes the meaning of what they had just endured. She met his gaze without wavering, stepping closer until her voice was only for him. Now you understand. To keep me is to keep this. The struggle, the burden, the land itself. Do you still choose it? Her words pierced deeper than any bullet could. He thought of the life behind him, the endless trails, the saloons where men forgot themselves, the towns where promises turned hollow. He thought of the silence of the desert, the way it demanded truth. And he thought of her, standing unbroken in the midst of battle, her vow heavier and truer than anything he had known. His voice came quiet but steady. Yes, I keep you. For the first time, her expression softened, the fire in her eyes tempered by something gentler. It was not relief, nor victory, but a recognition that he had stepped into a path he could never leave. She touched his hand briefly, enough for the warmth to pass between them, then turned back to her people. The wounded were lifted, the fallen honored in silence. The Apache gathered their weapons, their movements efficient but touched with grief. They spoke little, for the desert did not require many words. The girl moved among them with quiet authority, her presence steadying them. Though young, she carried the weight of someone who had already been chosen to lead. The man followed her into the canyon as the day stretched on, leaving behind the ground where the battle had been fought. He knew the soldiers would return, perhaps in greater numbers, but for now, there was quiet. The sun dipped low, painting the desert in deep colors, and the air grew cool once more. The fire they built that night was small, its glow reaching only far enough to remind them they were alive. Sitting beside her again, the man felt the heaviness of what lay ahead. He had thrown away any chance of returning to the life he once knew. To the world of soldiers and towns, he was now an enemy. To the Apache, he was not yet one of them, but he had chosen their side. The trail forward would be harder than any he had walked, but it was no longer his alone. The girl's voice broke the silence, softer now, touched by the weight of night. You could still leave. The desert is wide, and it hides those who wish to vanish. He shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. I've vanished long enough. It's time I stand where I belong. She studied him for a long moment, then gave a slight smile, the first he had seen. It was not a smile of ease or comfort, but of recognition. She leaned closer, her words carrying only for him. "Then you are not alone." The fire crackled, sparks drifting into the dark sky where stars spread, endless and bright. Around them her people rested, their shadows stretching against stone. The desert seemed to breathe again, no longer choked with smoke and dust, but alive with the whispers of wind through sage and mesquite. The man knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more battles, more soldiers, more choices that tested the vow he had made. But for the first time in all his wandering, he felt anchored, not by chains, but by the bond of something real. The girl's whisper echoed still in his memory, but now it was no longer a question. It had become a truth. Forever was not a promise made lightly in the desert. Forever was carved into the land itself, into the stone and wind, into the struggles of those who fought to remain free. As he sat beneath the endless sky, her hand resting lightly over his, he understood that he had stepped into forever the moment he had chosen her by the fire. The desert kept its silence, but in that silence lay everything lost: love, burden, and belonging. And as the night stretched long, the man realized that the land had finally claimed him, not as a drifter, but as part of its story. Bound to the Apache girl whose vow had changed everything.